I'm going to deal with the middle part of Christopher Lasch's Revolt of the Elites tonight. And just to give you a preview of where we're headed, there's quite a bit we're going to cover. One thing he does in this part of the book is deal with what he calls the third place and the decline of the third place, where people meet, where it's not the home and it's not work. And, your neighborhood bar, your restaurant, whatever, where did that go and what's the impact of that? He's going to talk about social isolation and the many reasons for it, including our modern notion of marriage. He's going to talk about the decline of neighborhood life, the way that neighborhoods have become more or less just a place to park your car, or they don't have any distinctiveness, they don't have any neighborly feel. He's going to also write about false tribalism, in which cultural forces try to keep people apart instead of giving them some sort of common culture. He's also going to talk about how progress is not working for all people. We've already gotten a glimpse of this. There's the small global professional class that doesn't really, in his view, have all that much to do with or all that much in common with the rest of the people, many of whom are working for them or selling them stuff at Walmart. He's also going to discuss the decline of politics. In his view, politics is really kind of a lost art. He also talks about how we're over-mediated, that politicians need to find a way to speak directly to each other and to us. And he also complains quite a bit about the state of higher education and what it is and is not doing, but especially the idea that it's been sort of overtaken by the market. So there's a lot to cover here. He himself covers a lot of ground. Actually, the very last thing that he says is extremely interesting. So I encourage you to stick around for this entire bit. Just giving you the highlights. And so the first subject that he talks about is the so-called third place. And he says it's the pub and the coffee shop, or I would also add the neighborhood restaurant, which at first appear to have nothing to do with politics or the civic arts, he says, make their contribution to the kind of wide-ranging, freewheeling conversation on which democracy thrives. And now even they are threatened with extinction as neighborhood hangouts give way to shopping malls, fast food chains, and takeouts. Our approach to eating and drinking is less and less mixed with ritual and ceremony. It has become strictly functional. We eat and drink on the run. Our fast-paced habits neither leave time nor, more important, places for good talk, even in cities, the whole point of which, it might be argued, is to promote it. He's got a point there. You go to a big city, you expect to be around a lot of people, and you are, but it doesn't necessarily increase the amount of actual contact that you have with them. And so with shopping malls, fast food chains, takeout food, and so on, there's very little reason for us to go, he's saying, and hang around people we don't know long enough to actually strike up a conversation with them. This was published in 1994, and I guess that was before the internet had become such a pervasive part of everybody's lives, where their social life and a lot of their economic life was online too, so that's certainly added to the phenomenon. And we usually think that this is a recipe for loneliness, which is he's not disputing, but he's talking about the civic consequences of it, that we are not together we don't hang out with other people that we don't know well long enough to actually form any sort of conversation with them. In the third place, he says decency is more highly regarded than wealth or brilliant achievement. And that would be because people don't even know how wealthy or brilliant you are when they meet you in the diner. And decency, he says, we might add, is the preeminent civic or political virtue. The decline of participatory democracy may be directly related to the disappearance of third places. Then, in addition to the disappearance of third places, he says that we've placed a great deal of emphasis on this one institution of marriage to provide all the sociability that is now lacking because of our overly isolated lives. He said it was a new and basically flawed ideal of marital intimacy, not the women's movement that undermines single-sex sociability. Like the shopping mall, marital togetherness was essentially a suburban invention. Well, I can try to break that down a little bit. We place too much emphasis on this one partner to fulfill all of our social, psychological, and spiritual needs. No one can do that. That's probably why so many marriages end up in divorce. You know, you're over relying on your spouse when your marriage turns into some sort of battle in which you claim that you're not getting enough attention, etc. But this is the American marriage when it still exists. So there's this overemphasis on the saving effect of this one relationship. He also talks about how at the same time that we've had a decline in sexual segregation, meaning that women have been able to, move into various other spheres of life that they weren't allowed to before, we have more segregation by age. And again, he's focusing on the civic impact of this. The tavern used to be, he says, an important agency linking generations and encouraging young men to set aside the lesser habits of adolescence. It's a place you could go where you'd meet other men, and or if you're talking about, now in 1994 when he's writing, men and women both being able to hang out like that. But with the decline of the third place, you don't have that, and the American society moves in the direction of age segregation. So if people hang out, so to speak, it's in a social group or a club or a church club or whatever that actually often explicitly says it's for this age group. Well, how are people supposed to learn from each other or hear each other's experience so that we can become a community of citizens if we're segregated by age? To top that thought off, he says the organization of childhood by adults has to be seen as another chapter in the decline of the third place and the corresponding rise of that powerful dissolving agent known as the American way of life. Now, of course, what he means by that is we choreograph our children's childhood and, do not allow them to be impacted by random chance, right, of meeting up with other kids we don't know, or of interacting with us in an informal way. Everything has to be sort of programmed, or at least that's the experience of the middle class and up. He has a chapter on how big cities like New York used to foster this idea that you could be of an ethnic group, you could be of a sort of tribe, but you were also part of the larger American society and culture. But he says here in chapter 7, the new tribalism, which finds favor not only among postmodernist academics, but in the media, in the world of commercial entertainment, and in the cultural boutiques and salons frequented by yuppies, appears on the scene at the very moment when tribalism has ceased to have any substantive content. Those city neighborhoods, he says, are being destroyed in the name of economic progress. A yuppie, by the way, is a 1980s acronym for Young Urban Professional. He says, tribalism is the latest fashion thrown up by a consumerist capitalism that is rapidly replacing neighborhoods with shopping malls, thereby undermining the very particularism it eagerly packages as a commodity. Well, that's interesting because he's saying that people are trading an actual sort of, in some cases, ethnic identity, which sat better with the overall American culture, for a sort of false tribalism that is more like a consumable, an identity that's sort of prepackaged and actually is profitable, in which going to a shopping mall, of course they used to exist, now it's, strip malls and the internet, but going to a shopping mall and buying clothing that, identifies you with a particular group or with a particular sub culture. I think that's the kind of thing he's talking about. Then in chapter 9, he turns to the economy, and he claims, and we've already gotten kind of a hint of this in the first part of the book, that the progress that is extolled by the so-called elites is progress for them, but isn't progress equally for everybody, and this is creating a rift in American society. And this was, again, in 1994. He says, the social effects of the communications revolution, we are told, will include, that would be like the information revolution, I think is more or less the same. He says, will include an insatiable demand for trained personnel, an upgrading of the skills required for employment, and an enlightened public capable of following the issues of the day and of making informed judgments about civic affairs. Instead, we find college graduates working at jobs for which they are vastly overqualified. The demand for menial labor outstrips the demand for skilled specialists. The post-industrial economy, it appears, promotes an interchangeability of personnel, a rapid movement of one type of work to another, and a growing concentration of the labor force in technically backward, labor-intensive, non-union sectors of the economy. So, one of the reasons for this is that technology has progressed so rapidly that many tasks that used to be done by people are done by computers and by machines. This and manufacturing in many cases going overseas means that a lot of people are left in more precarious service type employment. They may not be doing backbreaking labor anymore. They may be doing the same type of task all day long using a computer or behind a checkout register. But he's saying that, they may have a higher education, but they don't technically need it to do the jobs that they are doing. And oftentimes people graduate from college and get a job that is of that nature, because that's all there is. So he begins to make the point that, educated or not, most people who work in this new economy don't have, and maybe don't need to have to do their jobs, the kind of education it would take in order to be citizens in the truest sense of the word. And he goes into this discussion of the decline of politics. He complains about the decline in political debate, and he tries to bust through some myths. He says political debate began to decline around the turn of the century. That's the 20th century. Curiously enough, he says, at a time when the press was becoming more responsible, more professional, more conscious of its civic obligations. In the early 19th century, the press was fiercely partisan. Until the middle of the century, papers were often financed by political parties. So he's saying that our often heard complaint that the media is biased, that, it's partisan and such, and that this is the reason why we don't have actual, information coming through, and we don't have really good debates. We have shouting matches. That he doesn't seem to think that's the reason. Apparently he thinks that people can be fairly well informed even if they're being served by a very partisan press, as long as that press is actually giving information, not just facts, but arguments, and arguments well made. What Christopher Lasch really seems to dislike is the type of thing that's become exemplified in these debates especially the latest round of presidential debates, where people are just basically taking pot shots at each other, or on cable news, these days when various pundits are going back and forth with each other. Lasch seems to think this is encouraged by the media because basically it makes them money. It turns politics and debate into not politics and debate, but some sort of sideshow, or actually the main event, of entertainment. But this is not informative. He says that candidates should instead insist on directly debating each other, instead of responding to questions put to them by commentators and pundits, like the debates of old, basically, where no one mediated. This is interesting. He says the candidates' passivity in this regard, their passivity and subservience to the media, lower them in the eyes of the voters. They need to recover their self-respect by challenging the media's status as arbiters of public discussion. I guess this would be something like, if we had to translate that into today's experience, it would be something like the presidential candidates having a debate, like some of these public intellectuals, like, say, Jordan Peterson debating Christopher Hitchens. This is kind of prophetic because, these debates are going on all the time now on the internet amongst these public intellectuals, and people love it. I mean, they're getting huge audiences. They're taking it into various cities and putting these things out for live audiences. So it's even coming off the internet into your arena or whatever. Obviously, we have a public that is kind of starving for this kind of thing. And imagine if presidential candidates did that without the mediation of, say, cable news networks. However many, candidates together with a bunch of mics sitting around a table talking and having to deal with each other. That would be really interesting. So Lasch says a refusal to play by the media's rules would make people aware of the vast illegitimate influence of the mass media that has come to exercise in American politics. It would also provide the one index of character that voters could recognize and applaud. And finally, he gets to higher education. And this is such an excellent point. I just need to emphasize this. This is really true in my experience. He says, economic stratification means that a liberal education, such as it is, has become the prerogative of the rich, together with a small number of students recruited from select minorities. A liberal education means the liberal arts and sciences, classes in literature, philosophy, history, economics, biology, chemistry, blah, 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 modern languages. What it takes to get a Bachelor of Arts degree is being derided as impractical because it doesn't lead directly to some sort of specific job in every case. People have more or less been sold a bill of goods that's what an education is all about. And so what he's saying is the rich still have access to the type of education that they need to actually take part in the political process and be citizens and run the country, whereas the rest of us, the hoi polloi, so to speak, are being told to get a practical, more or less vocational education. And it's not that people who are in business and accounting can't get a liberal education, but they'd have to go out and get it. And universities might need to require more liberal education added to such a degree, but they're squeezing out that type of education so that many students come out with a bachelor's degree that is vocational. He says the great majority of college students relegated to institutions that have given up even the pretense of a liberal education study business, accounting, physical education, public relations, and other practical subjects. They get little training in writing, seldom read a book, and graduate without exposure to history, philosophy, or literature. Their only acquaintance with the world's culture comes through required courses like Introduction to Sociology and General Biology. That type of flat education relegates them to fill a slot in the economy, but doesn't give them a lot of tools for expanding beyond that slot, and certainly does not help them become more engaged and powerful democratic citizens. Lasch argues that a lot of people in higher education are out of touch, but not out of touch in the way that a lot of people who are critics of higher education think they are. You know, the criticism is that there's somehow this it's nonsensical, this notion of cultural Marxism. There really is no such things. Those two terms are opposed to each other. In my experience, they're not even mainly left-wing anymore. They're highly professional people who are there to create other professionals. But the problem is higher education doesn't encourage academics to speak to the general public. He says no one gets tenure by writing for the general public. Instead, they write books and articles that are aimed at academia, so they're read by very few people. He says they write self-referential literary studies, which means that they cite each other, and they may read each other within these very narrow little realms, but their way of communicating cannot penetrate outside the ivory tower, which is why no one needs to be afraid of the influence of academics at the moment. But shouldn't they? Because this is the brain trust, so to speak, of the country, or at least one part of it, that is spending far too much time more or less spinning webs rather than having any sort of social impact. In fact, it's frowned upon to have a popular and social impact. And I'll just leave you with this. This is a very long quote, sorry, but this is from the end of, or near the end of chapter 9, which is the second part of the book. But it's just so right on. He says, when the children of the 60s received their professorships and deanships, they did not abandon the dream of radical cultural transformation. They set out to implement it. Now, instead of attempting to destroy our education institutions physically, they are subverting them from within. No doubt they would like to think so, but their activities do not seriously threaten corporate control of universities. And it is corporate control, not academic radicalism, that has corrupted our higher education. So let me pause there, okay? He's saying some of those 60s hippies, they got into the professoriate, they thought they were going to become radicals and change the world, but really all they did was spin webs, and meantime, corporate control of the universities became a real thing. And their own interests were tied up with that corporate control. So he writes, it is corporate control that has diverted social resources from the humanities into military and technological research, fostered an obsession with quantification that has destroyed the social sciences, replaced the English language with bureaucratic jargon, and created a top-heavy administrative apparatus whose educational vision begins and ends with the bottom line. One of the effects of corporate and bureaucratic control is to drive critical thinkers out of the social sciences into the humanities, where they can indulge a taste for theory without the rigorous discipline of empirical social observation. Theory is no substitute for social criticism, the one form of intellectual activity that would seriously threaten the status quo, and the one form that has no academic cachet at all. Social criticism that addressed the real issue in higher education today, the university's assimilation into the corporate order, and the emergence of a knowledge class whose subversive activities do not seriously threaten any vested interest, would be a welcome addition to contemporary discourse. For obvious reasons, however, This kind of discourse is unlikely to get much encouragement either from academic left or from its critics on the right. That would be because the academic left gets paid for spinning webs of theory, I guess, is what he's saying. And the right is pretty much getting what it wants because most of the university is working for it, for corporate interests, let's say. It has become extremely pragmatic. It is creating worker bees. It's also funded in a lot of colleges. There's an awful lot of funding direct from private industry to support the research and the type of professors that they think will benefit the country because they benefit their bottom line. That sort of selling out to the corporation so that what you teach is what corporate interests want you to teach is precisely the type of thing that happened when scientists supported the tobacco industry, which Orestes writes about in Merchants of Doubt, which is why I put up that previous video. We would be naive to think that there's absolutely no influence on the way people think and their findings. And I think this is a lesson for all of us that we have yet to really imbibe. What's that phrase? He who pays the piper gets to basically call the song. So Christopher Lasch has kind of thrown a lot at us here. I think a lot of this is really pretty prescient. It's pretty relevant for our current situation, even though it's over 20 years old. But he could see many things coming. So next time I'll try to take on the third part of the book and we'll finish it up, I think. All right, bye.